Hi there, today I am here to offer some helpful hints on preparing the Andante and Allegro by Barat. This is this year's All Southern All State piece for euphonium. So first off, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are consistently practicing with a metronome. You want to make sure that you can play through all these sections without slowing down or stopping. So practice with the metronome and then record yourself. I like to use the app Tunable, and what's really nice is if you have an iPad, you can record yourself on the app, and when you listen back, you can have the tuner section up and you can watch your intonation. And what I like to do is I go through it and I mark anything that is consistently sharp or consistently flat, and then I put arrows up and down to try to remind myself to work on the intonation. While you're doing that, you may want to experiment with some alternate fingerings. So euphoniums are notorious for playing out of tune. So you have to really work with a tuner to feel comfortable with your intonation. So throughout the piece, what I did was I most of the time played almost all my upper Fs, 1 and 2, instead of open, because the open was so incredibly sharp. So if I played 1 and 2, it might be a little under pitch, but it was easier to lip up a few cents than to try to lip it down 20 cents. So doing stuff like that is going to help your overall intonation. But you know, if you're practicing with a tuner consistently, you're going to start understanding what notes are out of tune and what you need to do with those notes. Then what I would do is I would go through the piece and I would mark all the places I'm going to breathe. So you want to make sure that you're not breathing so often. So you want to see if you could make maybe 4-measure phrases, and just make the phrase as long as possible. And you want to just make sure that you're breathing where it makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the first section. So this first section, the Andante moderato, we come in piano on an F. So you want to make sure that you feel really good about coming in piano on that F. So it may be something where you play a bunch of Fs really soft and make sure you can do it 10 times in a row without making a mistake. And then after that F, we have 2 eighth notes that are marked with staccatos and a slur mark. So what I do is I legato tongue those, because you want to make a difference between the notes that are just regular slurs than the ones that are marked with the staccatos and the slur. So just put a light da tongue on it, and that will be good to make a difference. Then in our 4th measure and our 12th measure of this section, some editions say poco rubato and some don't say anything at all. But what you can do is you could phrase this measure, and where it's not necessarily perfectly in time, you could play 1, 2, 3, da 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 da, something like that. Or you can play it perfectly in time. I think either way works, but you just want to be consistent with it. Also with those same measures, make sure that you're holding the half note that's tied to the 8th note long enough. Make sure you're thinking 1, 2, 3, and a 4. Most of my students don't count and end up coming in too early. So make sure that you're really counting in your head and keeping the time. So then the next thing I would talk about in here is the overall dynamic contrast. So we're starting piano, and then 8 measures later we are making a big crescendo to mezzo forte, and then about 4 measures later making a really, really big crescendo to forte. So you want to make sure that we can hear that difference. So making sure you're starting really soft and making a really, really big difference. So when you record yourself, listen back and make sure that you hear that contrast. And if you don't, then you need to do more, okay? More contrast. And then right before the agitato, we're gonna make a small decrescendo, and then we're down to piano again. But then 4 measures later, huge crescendo to forte. So just make sure that you convey those dynamics. Okay, so now let's look at the second section. This section is just the same type of thing. You want to make sure you can play it. I play this at about quarter note equals 120. You just want to make sure that you can play through it without slowing down or stopping, and you're doing a lot of, there's a lot of dynamics, so make sure we hear all that dynamic contrast. And just make sure you feel really comfortable with all those scales. The last section is the most difficult technically. So this is where you want to put your metronome on a very, very slow tempo and make sure that you can play it very, very precisely at the slow tempo. And then as you can play it, say you put your metronome at 70 and you can play through it perfectly without stopping and without slowing down, then go up a couple clicks, then up a couple more clicks until you get to a tempo that you feel really comfortable with. You want to make sure that this whole section you play at the same tempo. So make sure, like, say you were to put your metronome at 136 at the beginning of this section. You want to make sure that when you get to maybe the very last line, that you don't have to play it way slower. So whatever tempo you can play the hardest part at, the hardest technically for you, is what tempo you're going to play the whole last section at. Okay, just make it really, really consistent. Looking at the third and I think it's the 7th measure of this section, I think these 2 measures are the ones that are maybe the most technically difficult, just because it's hard to make sure that you're centering on every note. So making sure that you're dee da da dee da da, that you're getting every single note. So probably those 2 sections you're going to have to practice really slow over and over again till you feel really comfortable with it. Then the next section, which is in this edition marked agitato, I suggest that you do these in 4 measure phrases. So try not to take a breath after every half note. Start piano, make huge crescendo mezzo forte, and then even more crescendo, and then back down to piano. Okay, then we have another 4 measure, same thing. Okay, with this section, you want to make sure that you're playing all of the articulations that are written. So in that agitato section where we have a mezzo forte, make sure that you're doing the articulation, the slur 2 and then tongue, dia da dia da 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 da, that you're playing that correctly. And then later when we come to the fortissimo, when we have those triplets, that all 3 notes are slurred together, dia dia da. Okay, let's see. Okay, so having doing all of that stuff, recording yourself over and over again with a metronome, okay, making sure that when you listen back, am I using the very best sound? Do I have the best sound possible? Am I playing in time? Am I slowing down? Am I stopping? Am I playing in tune? Am I phrasing? Do I like the way this sounds? and am I playing all the right articulations? You want to be listening for all of those things and trying to, make it as precise as possible and as beautiful as possible. You may want to experiment with using vibrato. For those of you who have never used vibrato before, we do it with our jaw, and we have this up and down motion here that does that vibrato. And what I like to do is put it more at the end of longer notes, put a little shimmer at the end of the note, and it makes it really beautiful. So that might be something you want to experiment with. And then if you just practice a lot and record yourself and use a tuner and use a metronome, then you're going to be in a really good spot to go in and play really comfortably and precise. Okay, you want to make sure that, say there, whatever's the hardest technical section for you, whether it's slurring up to the high B flat, or whether it's one of these technical fingering things, don't just go into the audition hoping that it's going to happen. You got to make sure that you feel 100% confident that you can play it. So, and that all has to do with practicing slow, and then slowly speeding up to what tempo you feel comfortable with. And I think if you do all these things, you have the keys to a very successful audition. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope it helps. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.